and freedoms. Now, in Britain today, these rights and freedoms are protected by a much maligned Human Rights Act that incorporates the Convention on Human Rights, that in turn reflects the Universal Declaration. Let's look at some of those and look at how they impact or not on our security. Are they always the opposite of security, or are they interconnected with it? Article 2 of the Human Rights Act is the right to life. Now there's an idea, a right to life. Clearly not to eternal life. You know, even lawyers can't deliver what scientists and doctors haven't managed yet, but nonetheless a very, very important right to be protected by the state from threats to you. And in particular, this fundamental human right means that when things go wrong, particularly when people die in custody or at the hands of the state, or because of negligence by law enforcement authorities and so on, they have a right to some kind of inquiry. So they have some sense of what went wrong and how it might not happen again. In recent weeks, my colleagues at Liberty were able to help a wonderful woman called Verna Bryant get an inquest into the death of her daughter, Naomi. Now, this is a really, really interesting story about human rights, about personal security, and about the myth and the spin surrounding the Human Rights Act in this country. Some years ago now, a man called Anthony Rice was released from prison. He need not have been released from prison. He was serving a life sentence for terrible crimes against women and children in particular, violent and sexual crimes. And he was let out on licence by a parole board that wasn't even shown the full list of his previous convictions. Cock up, not conspiracy. That's the way life is sometimes. So out he went, out of prison, and one of the first things he did was to befriend a vulnerable woman called Naomi, and he murdered her in her home. And in the understandable grief and debate that followed, the Chief Inspector of Probation of the time blamed the Human Rights Act and blamed human rights lawyers who would have appeared before the parole board and argued that this man could be considered for release. So that's great. Human Rights Act is scapegoat. And Verna, the dead woman's mother, was photographed, again by the Sun newspaper, the current bun, my favourite, was photographed tearing up the Human Rights Act, a large photograph, and saying, "What about my daughter's human rights? What about my daughter's human rights? What about the victim? Why is it always the criminal? Why is it always the accused, the defendant? Why not the victim? Do they not have human rights too?" And you know what I thought? I thought she's got a point. So I went to see Verna Bryant with a colleague, and it emerged that far from the impression that you got in the newspaper of a vengeful woman who wanted to see the Human Rights Act in this country scrapped and not there to protect anyone anymore, I met a very quiet and thoughtful and in many ways visionary woman who said, "I believe that everyone has human rights. I believe prisoners have human rights. I wouldn't want anyone treated badly, even in prison. I just think that my daughter should have been better protected, and I want to find out why she wasn't." So we represented Verna, and we tried to get an inquest. And the authorities didn't want an inquest. They said, "Who needs an inquest? We know the cause of death was unlawful killing, and that's the end of it. A man murdered a woman, and that's the end of it. There's nothing more for anyone to learn from this. But Werner disagreed. She wanted to know how it came to pass that this man was let out of prison when he was serving a life sentence. There was no reason to let him go. And how this kind of tragedy could be made less likely in the future. So using this principle, this law, Article 2 of the Human Rights Act, we were able to challenge the coroner's initial decision not to hold an inquest. And after some toing and froing, the inquest took place. And what was revealed? A catalogue of incompetence, I am sorry to say, on the part of various authorities who didn't communicate with each other, who didn't communicate with the parole board, and a very sad tale indeed. But Werner feels that finally, after years of fighting for answers, she has got those answers, and she feels that this kind of tragedy may be less likely in the future. I should say that the right to life is not absolute, and for obvious reasons. None of us are going to live forever, but we are entitled to protection from those charged with our protection, government, the authorities, and so on. Article 3 of the Human Rights Act, don't worry, I'm not going to go through them all. Article 515 says that nobody should be arbitrarily detained in a concert hall for more than 20 minutes. Article 3 of the Human Rights Act is the right not to be subject to inhuman and degrading treatment or torture. Interestingly, unlike the right to life, which is not absolute, and by the way, is not a pacifist doctrine, so it does allow taking life to save life in extremis, including in time of war or public emergency. But Article 3 is absolute. Never, 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 never in this framework of values is torture to be permitted. Now, sometimes, young people that I talk to say, isn't that interesting contrast that the human rights framework says you can take life to save life in certain circumstances, but torture, never. And it's something that I've thought about quite a lot myself, and maybe you'll have views about why the drafters of this framework came to that view. I think that there's an obvious historical explanation for it. I think that a generation that had seen people walking out of concentration camps and Japanese prisoner of war camps would have a very, very vivid idea of why you shouldn't subject human beings to torture and inhuman and degrading treatment. But I think also they knew, having lived it, that we all will die one day. It's not a nice thing to talk about. It's not a nice thing to think about, but we all will die one day. And it won't be the lawyers that get round that one. It may not even be the doctors. And we, of course, all aspire to a range of dignified deaths, if possible, surrounded by umpteen grandchildren and friends and glasses of champagne, and we all have different scenarios in our head. But we do have to go one day. But we don't have to endure degradation and torture and inhuman and degrading treatment. We can, as humanity, aspire to stamping that kind of behaviour out all over the world. And that is achievable, and that can be done without conquering mortality. And I think that, sometimes in war or in other situations, you literally play God and you take another human being's life. I'm not a pacifist, others are, but sometimes that happens. And when you do that, that's an awesome, terrible thing to do. And you do literally play God and you do choose the moment of another's death. But to torture them, to subject them to inhuman and degrading treatment, even with some kind of justification of security, is far worse than playing God. You play a much darker character altogether. And you degrade not just the person who you treat that way, but yourself and the society that you're part of. That, I think, must be the rationale and the basis for that distinction. But, it applies, again, not just to state actors, not just to inquisitors and policemen who shouldn't torture people in the cells. It also has to apply to people who call themselves rebels and freedom fighters anywhere in the world. There is no justification, ethical or legal, for behaving in that way. I talked about arbitrarily detaining people earlier, and you're being very patient at the moment. Article 5 of the Convention is the right against arbitrary detention. Article 6 is the right to a fair trial. Now, this is very, very familiar territory in this country, thank goodness. A very, very old tradition going far further back, all the way back to Magna Carta, the right against arbitrary detention, habeas corpus. I once spoke to a Conservative politician who said, "Why do we need all this European human rights nonsense? We've got habeas corpus. We've had it for longer than anybody." I said to him, "You're quite right. Habeas corpus is a wonderful, wonderful thing. And you know what? It's no less wonderful when it's translated from Latin into English and every other language in the world." And of course, during the War on Terror and at other times of threats to security, it is so, so tempting to abandon these fair trial rights, these due process rights against arbitrary detention and for fair trials. So, so easy, but very short-termist. And people who we spoke about Northern Ireland before, so many people, including those who've served in the military, talk about what a recruiting sergeant in justice can be when dealing with terrorism. And arbitrary detention is, by definition, sweeping up the innocent with the guilty and letting wider communities feel that there is no rule of law, there is no even hand for justice, and therefore there's no point supporting this framework or this society at all. Article 8 of the Convention is the right to respect for your personal privacy and your family life. And it's been an incredibly important article in both the European Convention and the Human Rights Act. And it's very interesting how different countries within Europe view it differently. So, for example, we in Britain are very resistant, rightly in my view, to the idea of compulsory identity cards. We like the police to identify themselves to us rather than the other way around. And yet, in Germany, they're horrified at how many CCTV cameras we have. So clearly there are some cultural differences in the way that we apply these values, and there's room for debate about how the balance should be struck. And here we are talking about balance. Privacy and security, privacy and the economy, privacy and health policy, how much information about all of us should be held on a particular database, and so on. And these balances will be struck differently at different times and in different countries. But what's important is that we go through a process of reasoning and we decide that we only intrude as much as is necessary, proportionate, and in accordance with law. And this is also true for other balanced rights like freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. Very, very controversial area in Britain at the moment, and freedom of speech. Incredibly important. We talked about the free press and the democracy before. Incredibly important, but again, not absolute. Mill famously said that I shouldn't be protected if I cry fire in a crowded playhouse. This would be the place to do it, wouldn't it? So, and inciting violence and inciting murder clearly should not be permitted.